There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a house when something unspoken has been placed on the table. Invisible yet heavy enough to shift the foundation of everything you thought you knew about the ground you stand on. I noticed it first on a Tuesday evening. The kind of autumn Tuesday where the light comes in through the kitchen windows at a sharp, golden angle, illuminating dust motes that dance in the air like suspended questions. I was standing at the counter, chopping vegetables for a dinner that suddenly felt less like a routine act of care and more like a performance of normalcy. Ethan was at the table, his laptop open, but he wasn't working. He was staring at the screen with a furrow in his brow that I knew well, the same expression he wore when he was trying to solve a problem that didn't have a clear equation. The kind of problem that involves human variables and unpredictable outcomes. We had been together for 3 years, a blend of my organized caution and his compassionate impulsivity that had somehow created a stable, warm life for us and his daughter, Sophie. I loved him for his heart, but I had learned over the years that a big heart sometimes leaves the door open for complications that logic cannot easily untangle. I watched him type something, delete it, then type it again, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, not quite panic, but a protective alertness that kicked in whenever I sensed a deviation from our shared transparency. I didn't ask him what he was doing immediately. I have always believed that demanding answers before someone is ready to give them is a form of aggression, and I prefer clarity over confrontation. So I finished chopping the carrots, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the board filling the silence, and I waited for him to bridge the gap. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual, tempered with a hesitation that made me pause with the knife still in my hand. He told me he had met someone, a girl near the subway station downtown, someone who needed help. He didn't look at me when he said it, which was the first signal that this was not a simple transaction of charity. Ethan was a single father, and he understood the weight of responsibility. But he also carried a history of wanting to fix things that were broken, perhaps because he had spent so much of his own life repairing the aftermath of his divorce, building a home for Sophie from the ground up. I put the knife down and wiped my hands on the towel, turning to face him fully, keeping my posture open, non-threatening. I asked him who she was, and he told me her name was Maya, that she was 17, and that she appeared to be homeless. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to dissect in that moment. I didn't react with the immediate skepticism that some might have expected. I know how the world works. I know that desperation looks different on everyone, and I know that Ethan's instinct to protect is his defining feature. But I also know that vulnerabilities can be exploited, and that kindness without boundaries can sometimes invite chaos into a structured life. I told him I understood that if she needed food or warmth, we could help, but I needed to know the extent of his involvement. He looked up then, his eyes searching mine for judgment, and when he found only careful consideration, he exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding. He explained that he had given her some money, bought her a meal, and promised to check on her again the next day. I nodded, accepting this as a starting point, but inside, the analyst in me began to file away data points. 17 years old, homeless, downtown subway station, Ethan's increased secrecy. It wasn't enough to raise an alarm yet, but it was enough to turn on the monitoring system in my mind. I believe in love, but I believe in verified trust even more. Love is the emotion, but trust is the structure that holds it up when the weather turns bad. The days that followed were subtle in their shift, like the gradual change of seasons that you don't notice until you realize the leaves have turned color. Ethan continued to see Maya, and while he didn't hide it from me, he didn't volunteer details either unless I asked. I made a conscious decision not to interrogate him, because I knew that pressure would only make him defensive, and defensiveness creates walls where there should be windows. Instead, I observed. I noticed that he was checking his phone more frequently during dinner, a slight distraction in his eyes when Sophie was talking about her school day. I noticed that he was withdrawing cash from the ATM more often, small amounts that wouldn't break our budget, but were noticeable in the pattern of our finances. I noticed that he came home later, citing work delays, but the tension in his shoulders suggested something more emotionally taxing than a spreadsheet or a client meeting. I didn't say anything about these observations immediately. I wanted to give him the space to come to me, to offer the information freely, because that is how intimacy is maintained, through voluntary sharing, not extracted confession. But as the week turned into 2, the silence around the topic of Maya grew louder. It wasn't a hostile silence, it was a protective one. He was protecting her, yes, but I began to wonder if he was also protecting himself from my potential reaction. I am not a cruel person, and I am not uncharitable, but I am pragmatic. I work in risk management, and my job is to look at a situation and identify where the structural weaknesses are. When a man I love starts investing time and resources into a stranger without a clear plan or oversight, my professional instinct overlaps with my personal concern. I started to worry not about the money, but about the emotional entanglement. Ethan is a good man, but good men can be manipulated by those who know how to mirror their own goodness back at them. I began to do what I do best. I gathered information without disrupting the environment. I didn't hire a private investigator. That would have been a violation of trust that might not be repairable. Instead, I paid attention to the details he let slip. He mentioned she liked strawberry milkshakes. He mentioned she was afraid of the dark. He mentioned she didn't want to go to a shelter because of the rules. These were specific, humanizing details which made the situation feel more real, but they also raised questions. If she was truly in crisis, why was she avoiding the systems designed to help her? Shelters have rules, yes, but they also have safety. Avoiding safety suggests either a fear of authority or a desire to remain unseen for a specific reason. I kept these thoughts to myself, letting them marinate while I continued to be the steady presence in our home. I made sure Sophie's routine remained unchanged, because regardless of what was happening with Ethan and Maya, Sophie's stability was the priority. I cooked dinner, I helped with homework, I listened to Ethan talk about his day, and I waited for the pattern to reveal itself. It is easy to react with anger when you feel excluded, but anger clouds judgment. I wanted to see the whole picture before I decided how to feel about it. I remembered a time early in our relationship when a misunderstanding about a text message had nearly derailed us because I had assumed malice where there was only confusion. I had promised myself then that I would never let assumption replace communication again. So I watched, and I waited, and I kept my heart open even as my mind worked through the probabilities. The escalation happened quietly, as these things often do, not with a bang but with a gradual accumulation of weight. It was a Thursday evening when Ethan came home and told me he had let Maya use our guest shower. This was the first boundary that felt significant to me. Bringing a stranger into our physical space, even for a hygiene routine, changed the dynamic from public charity to private involvement. I didn't refuse him, because refusing him would have made me the antagonist in his narrative of rescue, and I had no interest in fighting a battle over compassion. Instead, I asked the logistical questions. Had she shown identification? Did she have any known medical issues? Was there a plan for where she would sleep after she left our house? Ethan's answers were vague. He said she didn't have ID, that she seemed healthy, and that she was going to stay with a friend. The friend detail struck me as inconsistent with the homeless narrative he had started with. If she had a friend with a shower, why did she need hours? If she had a friend to stay with, why was she sleeping near the subway? I didn't point out the contradiction immediately. I simply noted it. I told him that I was comfortable with helping her, but that for the safety of our family, specifically Sophie, we needed to know more about who she was. Ethan agreed, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to believe the best of her, and he wanted me to believe the best of her too, without questioning the mechanics of it. He felt that questioning her motives was akin to questioning her humanity, and in his mind, compassion required a certain level of blind faith. I understand that perspective, I truly do. But I also know that true safety comes from verification. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat in the living room with my laptop, not to spy, but to understand the context of what we were dealing with. I looked up local resources for runaway teens, I read about the profiles of youth homelessness in our city, and I tried to map Maya's described behavior against the typical patterns. Most runaways seek out shelters eventually, or they reach out to specific organizations. Avoiding all systems is rare unless there is a specific threat they are hiding from, or unless the story of homelessness is not the whole truth. I didn't want to believe she was lying. I wanted to believe that Ethan's instinct was right, that there was a girl in trouble who needed a hand. But I also had to consider the possibility that Ethan was being used, and that our home was becoming a waypoint for something more complicated than a simple act of kindness. The next day, I took a different route to work, one that passed near the subway station where Ethan said he met her. I didn't go there to confront her, I went there to see the environment. It was a busy area, transient, loud, filled with people rushing to get somewhere. It wasn't a place where a 17-year-old girl would naturally linger unless she had no other option, or unless she was waiting for someone. I stood across the street for a moment, watching the flow of people, trying to imagine her there. I tried to feel what Ethan felt when he saw her, that pull to help, that immediate recognition of need. I could feel it, the tug of empathy that lives in all of us, but I also felt the guardrails of my own experience telling me to be careful. I went to work, and I focused on my tasks, but the situation was running in the background of my mind like an open application. I found myself researching legal liabilities, wondering what our responsibility would be if something happened to her after she left our house. I found myself thinking about Sophie, and how she would feel if she knew a stranger had been in our bathroom, if she knew her father was investing emotional energy into someone outside the family unit. These weren't jealous thoughts, they were protective ones. I love Ethan, and I love the life we have built, and I was not willing to let uncertainty erode the foundation we had laid. I decided that I needed to meet her, not to interrogate, but to assess. Human interaction tells you more than any background check ever could. Eye contact, body language, the consistency of a story when told to a new listener. I told Ethan that I wanted to meet Maya, that if she was going to be part of our periphery, I wanted to offer my own help, to show her that we were a team. Ethan hesitated, which confirmed my suspicion that he was keeping parts of this separate from me, not out of malice, but out of a desire to manage the situation himself. He finally agreed, saying he would bring her by for coffee on the weekend. I prepared myself for that meeting not as an adversary, but as a partner in this situation, ready to listen, ready to help, but also ready to see the truth. The day she came to our house, the air was crisp, the kind of Saturday morning that promises warmth later but starts with a chill. I made sure the house was tidy, not to impress her, but to create a neutral, calm environment. Sophie was at a friend's house, which I had arranged intentionally. I didn't want a child present for this initial interaction. When Ethan arrived with her, I was standing in the kitchen, pouring water. Maya was smaller than I expected, dressed in clothes that were clean but worn, layers that suggested she was prepared for the cold, but didn't have a permanent home to store heavier items. She looked at me with eyes that were too old for her face, guarded and watchful. I smiled, a genuine smile, and offered her a seat. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ethan and I pay bills and plan vacations, and I tried to make the space feel welcoming. I asked her what she liked to drink, and she asked for tea. Small details matter. As we talked, I listened more than I spoke. Ethan spoke for her mostly, filling in the gaps, telling me about how she missed her bus, how she lost her wallet, how she was trying to get to her aunt's in another state but needed help bridging the gap. The story was coherent, but it had the smoothness of a rehearsed narrative. When I asked her specific questions about her aunt, the answers became vague. She didn't know the street name, only the city. She didn't have the phone number memorized. These weren't necessarily lies, but they were inconsistencies that my mind flagged. I watched her hands. They were soft, uncalloused, not the hands of someone who had been living on the streets for weeks. I watched the way she held herself, not with the defensive hunch of someone expecting danger, but with a poised stillness that suggested upbringing. I didn't say any of this. I simply offered help. I told her I could buy her a bus ticket if she had the destination. I told her I could call the aunt if she had the name. She declined both, saying she didn't want to bother anyone, that she just needed a little more time. Ethan looked at me, hoping I would drop it, hoping I would just accept the story and provide the resources. I could see he wanted to be the hero, and I understood that need. But I also saw that Maya was uncomfortable with the offer of concrete solutions. People who are truly stuck usually grab onto lifelines when they are thrown. People who are hiding something tend to avoid the lifeline because it leads to verification. After she left, Ethan and I stood in the kitchen, the silence returning, heavier than before. He asked me what I thought, and I told him the truth. I said I believed she was in trouble, but I wasn't sure the trouble was homelessness. I said I thought there was more to the story, and that until we knew what it was, we needed to be careful about how much we involved ourselves. Ethan reacted with a flash of frustration, not at me, but at the situation. He felt I was being cold, that I was analyzing a human being like a case file. I told him that analyzing the situation was how I protected us, and that protecting us was how I loved him. It was a difficult conversation, one where we both stood our ground, but neither of us raised our voices. We agreed to continue helping her, but with boundaries. No more inside the house. No more cash, only direct purchases of necessities. It was a compromise, but I knew it wasn't the end of the tension. I knew I needed to find the root cause, not for the sake of being right, but for the sake of ensuring that our help was actually helping and not enabling a deeper issue. I started to dig a little deeper, using the tools available to me that didn't violate privacy laws but utilized public information. I asked around within my professional network, discreetly, about runaway cases in the area that matched her description. I didn't use her name, just the details. Nothing came up immediately, which wasn't surprising, but it confirmed that she wasn't in the system. Then, a few days later, I saw something that changed the trajectory of everything. I was at a grocery store, a high-end market on the other side of the city, the kind of place where people buy organic produce and imported cheeses. I was in the aisle looking for coffee when I saw a woman who looked familiar. It took me a moment to place her. It was Maya, but she wasn't dressed in the layered clothes she had worn at our house. She was wearing a cashmere sweater, well-fitted jeans, and she was pushing a cart that was half full. She wasn't alone. She was with an older woman, elegantly dressed, who was speaking to her with the animated frustration of a parent correcting a child. I didn't approach them. I didn't make a scene. I simply observed. I watched Maya roll her eyes, a gesture of teenage annoyance that was universally recognizable. A gesture that belonged to a girl who was safe enough to be rebellious. I watched the older woman pull out a black card to pay, a gesture of significant wealth. I watched them walk out to the parking lot, where they loaded the bags into a sedan that cost more than my first car. I stood there in the aisle, the hum of the refrigerators buzzing around me, and I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief, primarily. She wasn't homeless. She wasn't in physical danger from the streets. But alongside the relief came a sharp sting of betrayal, not because she had lied to survive, but because she had lied to us, to Ethan, who had opened his home and his heart based on a falsehood. And I felt a protective surge for Ethan, knowing how much this would hurt him, knowing how much he had invested in the idea of saving her. I didn't confront her there. I took a photo of the license plate, not to do anything malicious, but to have the data. I went home, and I waited for Ethan to return from work. I needed to be calm when I told him. I needed to be sure. I ran the plate through a public records search that I had access to through a colleague, just to confirm the registration address. It came back to a large estate in the hills, a name that was recognizable in local business circles. Maya wasn't a runaway from nothing. She was a runaway from everything. She was wealthy, privileged, and she had chosen to play the role of the victim to garner sympathy and support from strangers. I sat with this information for an hour before Ethan came home. I thought about how to present it. If I threw it at him like evidence in a court case, he would feel foolish, and he would defend her out of shame. If I approached it with compassion, focusing on why she might have done this, he might be able to hear it without crumbling. I chose the latter. I value our relationship too much to win an argument at the cost of his dignity. When Ethan walked through the door, he looked tired, the weight of the secret he was keeping visible in the slump of his shoulders. I was sitting at the table, the laptop closed, a cup of tea in front of me. I invited him to sit, and I told him I needed to talk about Maya. He stiffened immediately, preparing for a fight, preparing to defend his choice to help her. I held up my hand, a gentle signal to pause. I told him I wasn't angry at him. I told him I was concerned for him. I explained that I had seen her in a context that didn't match the story we had been told. I didn't accuse her of being a criminal. I didn't call her a liar. I simply stated the facts. I told him I saw her at the market with a woman who looked like her mother, in clothes that suggested she had access to resources. I told him I verified the address associated with the car. Ethan listened, and I watched the color drain from his face, not because he was angry, but because the realization was hitting him. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had handed her cash that had opened our door. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was quiet, stripped of the defensiveness I had expected. He asked me if I was sure. I told him I was. He asked me why she would do that. And that was the question that shifted the conversation from betrayal to understanding. I told him that sometimes, people who have everything feel like they have nothing, that sometimes the pressure of wealth and expectation can make a child feel invisible in a different way than poverty does. I didn't excuse the deception, but I offered a context for it. I told him that she wasn't in danger from the streets, but she might be in danger from herself, from the reasons that drove her to run away in the first place. Ethan looked up at me, and I saw the pain in his eyes, but I also saw the trust. He trusted me enough to hear this hard truth without pushing me away. He thanked me for telling him, for not letting him continue to walk down a path that was based on a lie. That moment was critical. It could have been the moment our relationship fractured, where I became the bearer of bad news and he became the foolish victim. But because I approached it with care, because I focused on our unity rather than his error, it became a moment of consolidation. We were a team again. We decided together that we needed to handle this carefully. We couldn't just cut her off, because if she was running away from home due to emotional distress, abandoning her now could push her toward real danger. But we couldn't continue the charade either. We needed to reset the boundaries. We decided to contact her parents. Not to get her in trouble, but to let them know she was safe, because knowing she was safe was the only way we could step back without guilt. I found the contact information for the family office, a public listing for the business associated with the address. I drafted an email, and I showed it to Ethan. I asked him if he was comfortable with the tone. He edited it, softening the language, removing any hint of accusation, framing it as a welfare check from concerned citizens. We sent it together. It was a small act, but it symbolized a major shift. We were no longer acting on impulse. We were acting on intelligence and shared responsibility. The response came within an hour. The mother, the woman I had seen at the store, called Ethan directly. I listened on the speakerphone, sitting beside him. Her voice was trembling, not with anger, but with relief. She told us that Maya had been gone for 3 days, that they had been frantic, that Maya was struggling with severe anxiety and had felt suffocated by the expectations placed on her. She thanked us, her voice breaking, for keeping her safe, for not letting her disappear into the system. She told us that Maya had told them about the kind man and his partner who had fed her and given her a place to wash. She hadn't told them the lies she told us, she had told them the kindness we showed. That changed everything. The deception was still there, yes, but the core of the interaction had been real. She had needed kindness, and we had given it. The wealth was incidental, the need was human. Ethan looked at me after the call, and I saw the tension leave his body. He reached out and took my hand, squeezing it tight. He apologized for not seeing it sooner, for letting his desire to help cloud his judgment. I told him that his desire to help was what made him the man I loved, and that my job was to be the guardrails that kept that desire safe. We agreed that we would not see Maya again, that her family would handle the professional help she needed, but that we had played a part in bringing her home safely. It was a resolution that didn't feel like a victory, but like a closure. The misunderstanding was shattered, not by anger, but by the truth, and the truth didn't destroy us. It strengthened the way we communicated. The days following the revelation were a period of quiet healing. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. The trust had been tested, and it had held. Ethan was more open with me about his interactions with strangers, not because I demanded it, but because he understood the value of my perspective. I, in turn, made an effort to acknowledge the good in his instincts, to validate his compassion even when I had to temper it with logic. We talked about Maya occasionally, wondering how she was doing, hoping that she was getting the support she needed. I found myself thinking about the nature of wealth and poverty, and how both can create isolation. I realized that my initial suspicion had been rooted in a fear of loss, a fear that something external would come in and take what we had built. But by facing that fear with clarity rather than anger, I had protected what we had without damaging the spirit of the man I loved. I remembered the moment I saw her in the grocery store and how I had chosen not to confront her there. That decision had been crucial. If I had made a scene, if I had exposed her in public, it would have traumatized her and humiliated Ethan. By choosing discretion, by gathering the facts and bringing them home to our private space, I had allowed us to process the information as partners. It reinforced the idea that our relationship was a safe harbor, a place where difficult truths could be brought without fear of immediate judgment. We spent the weekend, after the call, simply being together. We cooked a meal, a real meal, without the distraction of phones or secrets. Sophie came home, and the house felt full again, the invisible weight lifted. Ethan played with Sophie in the living room, and I watched them from the kitchen, feeling a profound sense of peace. I realized that the resolution wasn't just about the girl or the money. It was about us. It was about proving to ourselves that we could navigate a crisis without turning on each other. In so many relationships, the external stressor becomes the wedge that drives the partners apart. One blames the other for not seeing it or for overreacting. But we had chosen a different path. We had chosen to treat the problem as something outside of us that we would solve together, rather than something between us that we had to fight over. That distinction is everything. It is the difference between a relationship that survives and a relationship that thrives. I thought about the title of the situation, the way it might be described by others. Single dad helped a homeless girl. It sounded like a headline, something sensational. But the reality was much quieter. It was a story about a man who wanted to do good, and a woman who wanted to keep him safe, and a girl who was lost in her own way. And in the end, everyone was found. I didn't feel vindicated in a bitter way. I didn't feel like I had won an argument. I felt relieved. I felt connected. The warmth that returned to our home wasn't just the heating system kicking in. It was the return of ease between us. We could look at each other without the subtext of the secret hanging in the air. We could plan for the future without the shadow of the unknown. I realized that my vulnerability wasn't a weakness. Admitting that I was worried, admitting that I felt excluded, had been the key. If I had just acted coldly, if I had just investigated without communicating my feelings, Ethan might have felt policed. But by telling him that my investigation came from a place of love and protection, he accepted it. Communication is the bridge between logic and emotion. Without it, logic feels like cruelty and emotion feels like chaos. With it, they work in tandem. As the weeks turned into a month, the incident became a reference point for us, not a wound, but a lesson. We established a new protocol for charity. If we wanted to help someone, we would do it through established organizations where the verification was already done, where the resources were managed professionally. It wasn't a retreat from generosity, it was a refinement of it. We realized that we could do more good by supporting the systems that were designed to help than by trying to be the system ourselves. This realization brought us closer to our community, volunteering together at a local food bank on weekends. It was something we could do as a unit, something that didn't involve secrets or blurred boundaries. Standing side by side in that warehouse, packing boxes, I felt a sense of alignment with Ethan that was deeper than before. We were working toward a common goal with clear eyes. I watched him interact with the clients there, people who were truly in crisis, and I saw that his compassion was still intact, but it was now guided by wisdom. He didn't need to save everyone himself, he just needed to be part of the solution. And I watched myself too. I saw that I could let go of some of the control, that I could trust his heart because I knew my mind was there to balance it. We were a complete circuit. One evening, after a shift at the food bank, we drove home in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. The kind that comes after a job well done. Ethan reached over and took my hand, his thumb tracing the line of my knuckles. He told me he was proud of us. I asked him what he meant. He said he was proud of how we handled the Maya situation. He said he knew it would have been easy for me to say, "I told you so," or for me to shut him down completely. He said he appreciated that I fought for the truth without fighting against him. I told him that I couldn't fight against him because we were on the same side. That was the core of it. The misunderstanding had threatened to put us on opposite sides, me the skeptic, him the believer. But by seeking clarity together, we remained on the same side, facing the truth together. The wealth of the girl didn't matter in the end. The fact that she wasn't homeless didn't change the fact that she was hurting. And our response to that hurt, once we knew the truth, was what defined us. We didn't cast her out. We facilitated her return to care. We acted with integrity. That integrity was the real wealth we were protecting. I thought about the women I know, my friends, my colleagues, who navigate similar complexities in their relationships. How often do we choose anger over clarity? How often do we assume the worst because it feels safer than investigating the nuance? I wanted this story to be a testament to the power of patience, to the idea that you don't have to sacrifice your intuition to be loving, and you don't have to sacrifice your love to be intelligent. You can be both. You can hold space for the mystery while you solve the puzzle. The road ahead for us felt clear. There were no more hidden phones, no more vague explanations. There was just the honest work of building a life. Sophie was happy, sensing the stability even if she didn't know the details of the storm that had passed. Ethan was present, no longer distracted by the need to manage a secret. And I was secure, knowing that I had the tools to protect our peace without destroying our joy. The resolution wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything is perfect. Life is never perfect. There will be other challenges, other misunderstandings, other moments where the ground shifts. But I knew now that we had the blueprint for how to handle them. We would talk, we would verify, we would choose each other over the conflict. That is the only resolution that lasts. Looking back on that autumn, the golden light in the kitchen seems less like a spotlight on a problem and more like a warm memory of a time we grew up together. I remember the feeling of the knife in my hand, the sharpness of it, and how I chose not to use it to cut ties, but to prepare sustenance. I remember the silence at the table and how we filled it with truth instead of assumptions. I remember the relief of knowing that the girl was safe, and the greater relief of knowing that my partner was still mine, that our trust was intact. There is a profound strength in being the person who chooses clarity over anger. It requires a discipline that feels like love, because it prioritizes the long-term health of the bond over the short-term satisfaction of being right. I am 39 years old, and I have learned that love is not just a feeling. It is a practice. It is the practice of listening when you want to speak. It is the practice of investigating when you want to accuse. It is the practice of forgiving when you want to condemn. And in this practice, I found a deeper connection with Ethan than I had ever known. We had walked through the fire of a potential betrayal and come out the other side without burns. We had looked at the worst-case scenario and managed it with grace. The world often tells us that relationships are about passion, about the spark. But I have found that the enduring heat comes from the friction of two people working together to keep the lights on. It comes from the shared responsibility of truth. When I think about the title of that chapter in our lives, I don't think about the homeless girl or the wealth. I think about the single dad who wanted to help and the woman who helped him see clearly. I think about the partnership that emerged stronger because it was tested. And I feel a sense of gratitude for the misunderstanding, because without it, we might not have learned how strong our communication really was. We might not have learned that we could trust each other with the hard things, so I carry that lesson forward. I carry the memory of that Tuesday evening, the silence, the truth, and the hand held across the table. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is the foundation of everything that comes next. The warmth in the house now is not just from the sun or the heater. It is from us. It is from the knowledge that we can face anything as long as we face it together, with eyes open and hearts willing to understand. The story of Maya is over, but our story continues, written in the quiet moments of honesty, in the decisions to choose trust, in the daily reaffirmation that we are on the same side. And that is the only happy ending that matters. The rest is just noise. The rest is just the world turning. But here, in this space we have built, there is clarity. There is peace. There is love, restored and whole, waiting for whatever comes next, ready to meet it with the same intelligence and grace that brought us through the storm. I breathe in and I breathe out, and I know that we are okay. We are more than okay. We are ready.